You'd think by now the HOA would have learned not to mess with a man who owns the lake they're standing on, but no, not Sophie Ward. That Saturday morning, she marched down my dock like she was leading an army sunglasses on clipboard in hand barking orders at a tow truck driver who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "That boat's too big," she snapped. "It blocks community access. Remove it immediately." I just stood there on my porch, coffee steaming in my hand, watching the chaos unfold like a live comedy show. The driver hesitated, the chain clinked, and one of her board members slipped straight into the shallows with a splash that made the whole crowd laugh. Sophie turned scarlet, slapped a bright orange violation sticker on my hull, only for it to peel off instantly and stick to her own shoe. That's when Sheriff Tom, my brother, rolled up, hat tilted low, asking, "Ma'am, you got paperwork for this?" She didn't. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't just about a boat. They were about to find out they'd been trespassing on my lake all along. Before we dive in, drop your city and local time in the comments, and if HOA drama and sweet justice are your thing, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the ending twist. The morning air on the lake always smells like cedar and cold stone, the kind of air that wakes up your bones. I've lived long enough to know that peace is a daily decision, and out here when the mist lifts off the water like a blanket, peace feels like a thing you can hold. On most days, I sit on the porch rail with a chipped blue mug and watch trout rings expand and fade on the glassy surface. Kids in neon life vests shuffle down the dock. Old-timers like me compare lures and weather. A teenager in a beat-up canoe tries to look brave under a sky that's as wide as a promise. None of them has ever paid to be here. That was the deal my grandfather made with the place, and it became mine. Treat the lake with respect, and the lake will give it back. That's the part Sophie Ward never understood. Her world is measured in memos and violations in board votes and fonts, and as per Section 12, Paragraph B, she believes authority is a costume you put on blazer sunglasses, the click of heels on wood. But this water doesn't care what you're wearing. It cares who shows up to cut a tangled line and who pulls a kid out of the shallows when the wind flips a kayak. It cares about stewardship, a word I suspect Sophie's dictionary keeps under glass. When I was 14, my grandfather Earl Sanders stepped out with his Sunday hat on a Tuesday and told me to walk with him. We didn't go far, just to the boundary marker at the North Cove where the granite shows its ribs. He slid a sealed envelope from his coat and said, "You won't need this until you do, and when you do, you'll know." He had a slow way of talking that made every sentence feel borrowed from a clock. "Some folks will confuse paperwork with power," he said. "They'll try to redraw a shoreline with a pen. Water doesn't read. It remembers." Years later, when he passed that envelope, joined the deed in the bottom drawer of my old roll-top desk. The deed is older than most of the houses in town, vellum creased like an old Palm County seal pressed into it like a thumbprint. It records transfers, surveys, bearings, and distances. It references riparian rights and the original plat description when the cabin was a fishing shack and nothing more. You can trace 100 years of our family in those lines, births, droughts, booms, and the bite of winters that froze the cove clean. Every time I open that drawer, the paper carries the faint scent of cedar and old ink. For decades, I let people fish, boat, picnic. I'd fix a motor here, lend a paddle there. If the trash barrel filled, I hauled it. If an anchor snagged a stump, I eased it loose. In the ledger of favors and good mornings, we were all in the black. A handful of homeowners formed a neighborhood association 25 years back to wrangle landscaping and plow rotation. It meant nothing to me until the bylaws grew tentacles. Sophie arrived like weather you only notice after the trees begin to lean. She bought a crisp new house off the East Loop and began small, a friendly newsletter about mailbox paint, a tidy request for uniform porch lights. Then came the fines. Lawn height, porch chairs, a child's pop-up goal disturbing the aesthetic harmony. I call that last bit the moment the wheels started squeaking. People grumbled. A few paid to avoid arguments. Then Sophie ran for president and won by showing up the most and smiling the hardest. Her smile didn't reach the waterline. Truth is, I ignored it longer than I should have. I was busy running the bait shop out of the old boathouse, making small repairs, maintaining the public-facing friendliness that had kept the lake open and generous. When Sophie's first letter to me arrived, "Dear occupant," I laughed and fed it to the wood stove. The second one named my boat, and the third one suggested a shared shoreline management plan that read like annexation in pearls. I didn't burn those. I filed them right next to photos of the original boundary markers and copies of the county surveyor's notes. I started keeping a notebook too, dates, names, the weather, who said what, and to whom. People think memory is enough. It isn't. When paper comes for you, you meet it on paper. Neighbors started stopping by: Jim from the yellow ranch house, Linda from the place with the copper wind chimes, Nancy who bakes banana bread and leaves it on a porch like a blessing. They told me how the HOA's request letters had become failure to comply notices. Paul muttered that Sophie had stood at his fence with a tape measure and a look that could file a lien. I kept my voice low and my coffee hot and asked for copies, screenshots, recordings, anything that showed the creep from suggestion to enforcement. You don't swat at a hornet's nest. You suit up and move the hive. I wasn't out to win a fight. I was out to end one. That takes timing. Let a bully perform long enough, and the mask never just slips, it falls. I began ordering certified copies of the deed and chain of title from the county recorder, along with the riparian rights descriptions that map every inch of the shoreline that's mine to steward. I tracked the HOA's published boundary, its actual boundary, not the one Sophie talked about when she got excited in front of a camera. A dotted line can't cross a parcel line by force of will. It has to be grandfathered or purchased. Sophie had neither. Then came a phone call at dusk that tasted like a hinge turning. It was a banker in town, a man with a voice like bottle glass. He asked if I knew anything about the note on the marina improvements. The marina sits in a notch of land with a decent ramp and a run of slips cobbled together from 3 separate refurbishments across 15 years. It's been run badly and noisily, by people desperate to make it look like a yacht club without the yachts. The banker said the note was edging toward non-performing, and wondered quietly if I knew any interested parties. I stared out at the water, watched a ripple move like a whisper. I might, I said. Send over the paperwork. That's how you deal with a shifting shoreline. You don't shout. You gather. You study. You buy the sand before the storm. If the HOA wanted to play at authority over a lake they didn't own, I was going to meet them at the only table that matters: title, debt, and law. Not to punish, though. I'd be lying if I said the idea didn't satisfy me, but to restore a balance that had been disturbed by the sound of a bullhorn where there should have been birds. Meanwhile, the culture around the lake began to harden in the right places and soften in others. Folks who'd kept their heads down started standing a little taller. A teenager, the same canoe kid, asked me whether HOA can make rules for water. I told him what my grandfather told me: water remembers. I said the law remembers too if you take the time to write it down and keep it safe. He nodded like he understood and paddled off into a path of sunlight, so bright it made the rest of the cove look like a photograph fading at the edges. Sophie's emails multiplied. They shifted tone, hinting that my dock impeded communal visibility, that my boat was sized unsafely for a neighborhood amenity, that my Coast Guard registration was incompatible with subdivision values. That last one made me laugh out loud. Values, she said. As if dignity, neighborliness, and restraint weren't values big enough to be read from a porch in all caps. I replied once briefly with a photocopy of my deed's legal description and a note: your jurisdiction ends where my property line begins. I didn't hear back until she came down the dock with a tow truck, a clipboard, and an audience. People tend to think the law is a hammer waiting to fall. More often, it's a level you set on a piece of wood to show folks the bubble doesn't lie. I lined up my paperwork on the desk deed chain of title surveys, a printout of the HOA boundary filings, the stack of letters with their progressive shrillness marked and dated. On the wall above the desk hangs a black and white of my grandfather standing on new ice, testing it with a broom handle. He's wearing the same expression I had when I closed the desk and set my coffee mug down. There's more weight to carry and the ice will hold if you don't jump. The banker's packet arrived thick and dull, full of amortization tables and security agreements. I sharpened a pencil and took my time. The marina debt, it turned out, was secured by the improvements and the leasehold interest, not the land. The land beneath that was tied to an old clause. I had nearly forgotten an obscure right of first refusal, embedded in a riparian easement my grandfather negotiated, when the marina was barely 3 slips and a Coke machine. I sat back and laughed. It was the kind of laughter that comes at the precise moment a pattern clicks together, quiet, grateful, sharp at the edges. I didn't tell anyone. Not Tom, not Jim from the Yellow Ranch, not Linda with the wind chimes. You don't announce leverage. You exercise it with decency. I picked up the phone and called a lawyer. I trust a woman named Grace Holloway who believes commas matter because liberty sometimes lives between them. Grace, I said, I think we're about to buy a note. I could hear her smile through the line. About time, she said. Let's measure twice and cut once. Out on the porch, the sky tilted into evening. The lake turned to hammered pewter. Somewhere a kid laughed, and somewhere else a loon called low. My brother's cruiser rolled past on the road, a flicker of white roof through the pines, and he gave a quick 2-finger salute without stopping. He didn't need words to say, "I'm here when the wind picks up." I raised my mug in return, I know. All the while, Sophie kept building her little paper tower, stacking memos into the sky. She never noticed the foundation was on my land. And that was the lesson of the morning, the one that would turn into a day, then a week, then a reckoning. Some people think control is a louder voice. It's not. Control is knowing which drawer holds the deed and which phone call puts a mortgage in your pocket. And when the chain rattled on my dock and the sticker peeled off her shoe, I knew the lake had decided to remember out loud. By the next weekend, the story of Sophie's tow truck debacle had spread through the neighborhood faster than a summer storm. Every grocery line, every barbecue, every fishing dock conversation opened with someone saying, "Did you see her face when that sticker stuck to her shoe?" It had become local folklore overnight. And while most people would have felt embarrassed enough to crawl back into their fancy HOA boardroom and lick their wounds, Sophie Ward wasn't built that way. When people like Sophie fall, they don't retreat, they double down. They mistake laughter for mutiny, and instead of humility, they summon reinforcements. By Friday evening, I knew she was coming back. The clues were all there. HOA trucks parked near the gate, men in matching polos carrying clipboards, and one shiny black sedan idling too long near the boat ramp. I brewed an extra pot of coffee and waited. Saturday morning dawned humid and bright, the kind of day where sunlight hits the water and scatters like 1,000 mirrors. From my porch, I saw her marching down the gravel road again. Sophie Ward, queen of HOA bureaucracy, flanked by two loyal lieutenants, Carl Jenkins, a man whose personality could be replaced by a spreadsheet, and Deborah Ross, the neighborhood's self-appointed decorum enforcer. Both carried clipboards and self-importance in equal measure. Trailing behind them was poor Mark Hill, the tow truck driver from last week. His face said it all. He'd been dragged back against his better judgment. The truck itself looked nervous, if machines could feel shame. "Good morning, Mr. Sanders," Sophie called out, pretending politeness as her heels clacked across my dock. "I trust you're ready to cooperate this time." I took a sip of coffee and stayed exactly where I was seated in my rocking chair. "Morning, Sophie." "The fish are biting, but the nonsense still stinks." Her smile tightened. "We're not here for jokes. The HOA board reviewed your situation and voted unanimously to proceed with removal. Your vessel remains in violation of community size restrictions and obstructs shared shoreline access." Behind her, Mark scratched his head. "Ma'am, I told you last time this is a private dock." Sophie waved him off. "The HOA has jurisdiction over all properties that fall within the community view corridor." "The what?" I asked, feigning confusion. "The view corridor," she repeated confidently, as if saying it louder would make it real. "It's in our bylaws." "Show me," I said, setting my mug down and walking toward her. She rifled through a binder pages, fluttering like frightened birds. Nothing. Deborah leaned over, whispering frantically, and Sophie's eyes darted back to me, full of indignation and desperation. "The clause exists," she insisted. "Right," I said, "right next to the one about sacrificing goats on even-numbered Tuesdays." The crowd of neighbors, yes, they'd gathered again, laughed so hard someone dropped a cooler. Sophie's cheeks flushed crimson. "Proceed," she snapped to Mark. Hook the chain, Mark sighed and moved reluctantly toward the boat. Just as the steel links scraped across the dock, a familiar rumble echoed down the road. Sheriff Tom's cruiser appeared again, sunlight glinting off the hood. He stepped out, slow hat tilted, hands on his belt, like a man arriving to a comedy show he's seen before. "Morning, everyone," he drawled. "What's today's emergency? Somebody overwater their hydrangeas." Sophie spun toward him, desperate for authority. "Sheriff Sanders, we're conducting a lawful removal under HOA code." Tom tilted his head. "HOA code? You mean those pamphlets y'all printed on office paper, ma'am? This is private property. You're trespassing again." Her jaw dropped. "He's obstructing community access." "Community access to what?" Tom asked, peering over her shoulder. "His own dock, his own water." Mark dropped the chain and muttered, "Told you so." The laughter rolled like waves. Phones came out again, lenses gleaming like a field of dragonfly eyes. Sophie tried to rally. "I will not tolerate disrespect. This entire dock falls within the HOA's scenic jurisdiction." Tom's eyebrows rose. "Scenic jurisdiction? That a new one. It's in the bylaws." She barked. Tom nodded the way a man nods at a child who insists there's a monster under the bed. "Sure it is. And I bet you got a unicorn clause, too." The crowd howled. Sophie's hand trembled as she tried to slap another violation sticker onto my boat, but the wax surface once again refused her. The sticker slid off this time, landing squarely on the toe of her high heel. Even I couldn't help laughing then. "You might want to check your jurisdiction," I said. "Seems to have stuck to your foot again." Her lieutenants froze, unsure whether to help or pretend not to know her. Tom finally stepped forward, all humor gone. "Sophie, this is your last warning. If you or your board members step foot on this dock again without a lawful order, I'll have to cite you for trespass. And if you bring a tow truck again, I'll consider it attempted property interference." For a split second I thought she'd burst into tears. But pride's a stubborn fuel, it burns long after dignity runs out. She straightened her jacket and hissed, "This isn't over, Sheriff. You'll see." "I'm sure we will," Tom said, tipping his hat. When she finally stormed off her heels, clacking furiously against the planks, the crowd erupted into cheers. Someone even played mock trumpet sounds from their phone. I waited for quiet, then raised my hand. "Folks, let's not get too riled up. We don't need a riot on my lawn, but if you've got footage of what just happened, make sure you save it. Could come in handy someday." A few neighbors winked knowingly. Jim from the Yellow Ranch house shouted, "Don't worry, Carl, we've got more angles than a Netflix docuseries." When the laughter faded and people drifted back to their barbecues, I turned to Tom. "You think she'll back off?" he chuckled. "You're kidding, right? Sophie's the kind of woman who loses a battle and calls it a warm-up. You better keep your paperwork close." "I already do," I said. "Filed and time-stamped." He nodded approving. "Good. But watch her. People like that, they'll dig themselves a hole, and if you're not careful, they'll try to drag you in." I watched the tow truck disappear up the road, dust swirling behind it like a retreating storm. "Nah," I said quietly, "I'm done getting dragged." This time I brought a shovel. That night, I sat in the cabin with the ceiling fan turning slow and the smell of rain coming in through the screens. I printed copies of everything: photos, videos, HOA letters, county plats. I put them in a thick manila folder labeled Lake Sanders, Evidence File. There's a strange satisfaction in preparation. You don't feel angry anymore. You feel calm. You can almost taste the justice waiting, patient as stone. Over the next few days, the gossip only grew. Kids made TikToks with the sound of the sticker peeling off Sophie's shoe. Someone remixed her, yelling, "Remove it immediately," into a techno beat that played at the local bar. The HOA's weekly bulletin came out with a warning about false narratives on social media. That just made it worse. Still, I stayed silent. Every fight needs an audience, but real power doesn't shout. It shows up with documents and patience. By Wednesday, Sophie's tone had changed. She posted in the neighborhood Facebook group that certain individuals are spreading misinformation about HOA jurisdiction and that appropriate legal counsel has been retained. That post was my favorite kind. It meant she was bluffing. Real lawyers don't advertise like that. But I didn't underestimate her. People like Sophie thrive on performance. She'd be back and she'd bring props. So I got to work. I visited the county recorder's office and pulled copies of the HOA's filed boundary maps. Just as I suspected, their jurisdiction ended a full 100 yards before my dock. I asked the clerk to stamp and notarize the copies, then slipped them into my file. On the way out, I ran into Grace Holloway, my attorney friend. She saw the folder under my arm and grinned. "So the HOA circus still in town?" "Bigger tent every week," I said. She smirked. "Then keep the receipts, Carl. Paper beats noise every time." That night, as thunder rolled across the lake, I read through my grandfather's deed again. His handwriting in the margins, faded but steady, said, "To hold in stewardship, not in fear." It hit me then that this wasn't just about property or pride, it was about keeping a promise. A promise to protect something honest from people who build kingdoms out of bylaws and signatures. Sophie thought she could win through noise, fear, and paperwork. But I had something she'd never understand: roots, memory, and time. And if there's one thing I learned from the old man who taught me how to fish, it's this: you don't have to fight every fool who throws a line your way. Just wait until they tangle themselves, then reel in the truth nice and slow. By the time the storm passed and the rain hit the lake in silver ripples, I already knew how the next chapter would play out. Sophie was about to go from Queen of Fines to the main act in her own downfall. And this time, I was going to let the cameras roll. By the time dawn broke the following weekend, I could feel trouble brewing across the lake like static in the air before a lightning strike. The geese were restless, the surface of the water too still. I've lived here long enough to know that nature often gives you a warning before a storm, and sometimes that storm wears perfume and a pearl necklace. At precisely 9:07 a.m., my peace was interrupted by the distant whine of an SUV motor and the rhythmic click of heels. When I looked out there, she was Sophie Ward marching down the slope again, this time with even more fanfare. She'd brought a whole entourage, 2 board members in matching polos, a cameraman with a shoulder rig, and to my amusement, a thin man in an ill-fitting navy suit carrying a briefcase as though it contained the secrets of the universe. "This," she declared loudly, As she stepped onto the dock, is our legal counsel, Mr. Robert Klein, licensed attorney and representative of the Lakeview Homeowners Association. Klein adjusted his tie, which looked like it was strangling him, and tried to project confidence. "Good morning," he said, his voice a full octave higher than normal. "We're here on official business regarding non-compliance with Community Code 5B and subsequent property violations." I leaned on the railing holding my coffee mug like it was a front-row ticket. "That's a lot of words for trespassing." Sophie smirked. "We'll see who's trespassing when this is over." The neighbors began drifting out from their porches again the way birds gather when they sense crumbs. Phones appeared in hands. Someone even shouted "Round 2 baby" from across the cove. Robert Klein cleared his throat sweat, glistening on his forehead. Under Article 9 of the HOA Charter, the association reserves the right to enforce property codes on any area affecting communal aesthetics and access. "Affecting what now?" I asked, pretending to squint. "Aesthetics," he repeated proudly. "So you're saying my boat ruins your view?" "Precisely," Sophie said. "Its excessive size and reflective hull create a visual obstruction for other residents." Behind her, a neighbor named Jim whispered, "Yeah, it obstructs my boredom." I took a step closer. "Tell you what, Sophie. Since you're so sure about this, why don't we make it official? Go ahead, say it clearly for everyone here. You're claiming the HOA has legal jurisdiction over this lake." She lifted her chin, high voice echoing across the water. "Yes, the HOA has full jurisdiction over all properties visible from community boundaries, including the lake and all docks attached to it." I smiled slowly. "Perfect. That's all I needed." Robert looked confused. "What do you mean needed?" "Oh, you'll see," I said. The tension was broken by the sudden rumble of an approaching vehicle. Every head turned as a white van bearing the blue stripes of the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary rolled up. 4 officers stepped out, one holding a clipboard, another with a radio clipped to his vest. The crowd murmured. Sophie's smirk faltered for the first time. Morning, the lead officer said, scanning the dock. "We received a report of an unauthorized maritime seizure attempt." "Everything okay here?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Depends on your definition of okay." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Who called you?" "I did," I said, raising a hand. "Figured I'd better have the professionals here if someone's claiming federal water jurisdiction without knowing what riparian rights mean." The officer turned to Sophie. "Ma'am, are you attempting to enforce a maritime removal on this vessel?" Sophie hesitated. This isn't about maritime law. It's about community regulation." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Community regulation doesn't extend to navigable waters or private docks." "Do you have documentation from the county?" Robert began flipping through his binder, muttering like a man whose magician hat had just lost its rabbit. The pages were mostly highlighted printouts from the HOA website, and what looked suspiciously like a Wikipedia paragraph about common lake access. The officer frowned. "This isn't legal documentation. You can't enforce HOA bylaws here." Sophie tried to rally. "But the lake is within view of our subdivision." He gave her a look that could freeze lava. "So is the moon, ma'am. Doesn't mean you can ticket it." The laughter that followed was volcanic. Neighbors doubled over, some filming so hard their cameras shook. Sophie's face turned a shade of purple that made me worried for her blood pressure. And just when I thought it couldn't get better, one of the Coast Guard officers accidentally brushed Sophie's binder with his elbow, sending a few pages fluttering into the lake. Children started fishing them out with sticks, holding them up, and reading fragments aloud, phrases like HOA water rights and visual harmony enforcement. The whole scene looked like a sitcom come to life. I didn't gloat, though. I wanted to. Instead, I quietly sipped my coffee and let the moment cook. Finally, after a long silence, the lead officer turned to me. "Mr. Sanders, your paperwork looks in order. We can confirm this dock and vessel fall entirely within your private parcel boundaries." I nodded politely. "Appreciate it, officer. Coffee's hot if you want a cup." He chuckled. "We might take you up on that next time." When the Coast Guard left, the crowd burst into applause, cheering so loud it scared the gulls off the water. Sophie grabbed her soaked binder, her high heels squeaking against the dock, and tried to storm away with dignity. Unfortunately, dignity has a poor sense of balance, especially when your shoe soles are wet. Halfway up the slope, she slipped. Arms flailing, she managed to stay upright but not graceful. Someone caught it all on camera, slow motion, and everything. By nightfall, the video hit social media under the title HOA Lady Tries to Evict Coast Guard Gets Evicted by Gravity Instead. Within hours, it had over 5,000,000 views. By the next morning, it was on the local news. Tom called me just after breakfast, laughing so hard he could barely talk. "Carl, you turned our lake into a reality show." "I didn't turn it into anything," I said. She auditioned herself. He wheezed. She's on Channel 8 claiming she was set up by maritime conspirators. I rest my case, I said, sipping my coffee. Over the next few days, the memes kept coming. Someone photoshopped Sophie wearing a pirate hat holding a scroll labeled HOA code. Another added dramatic music, and the caption Karen vs. Coast Guard, dawn of fines. Even local businesses joined in. Jim's Hardware offered 10% off anti-slip boat wax, and a diner advertised the Sophie special, 2 eggs over easy and a side of humble pie. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid of the HOA anymore. They were laughing at it, and nothing destroys tyranny faster than mockery. But while the world laughed, Sophie stewed. I could feel it like pressure behind a dam. Pride doesn't drown quietly. Late Tuesday night, my phone buzzed with a notification from a contact at the local bank, the same one that held the marina's mortgage note. Carl, he said, you might want to know someone just tried to renegotiate the HOA's loan terms. A woman named Ward. I smiled in the dark, the moonlight glinting off the edge of the old deed framed above my desk. Let her, I said. She's just adding her signature to the rope. By Thursday, escrow on the marina note had closed under my newly formed LLC. It was official on paper. I now controlled the debt tied to the very heart of the HOA's operations. The next time Sophie strutted around the marina, she'd be standing on land her HOA technically owed me money for. And the best part, she didn't know it yet. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake gold, I sat on the porch with Tom and clinked bottles. You ever notice I said how some people are allergic to learning? He grinned. You mean Sophie? She's not allergic, I said. She's immune. We both laughed and the sound rolled across the water like thunder's gentle cousin. In the distance, I could see the marina lights flicker on tiny reflections trembling on the surface. It was beautiful, calm, perfect. And it reminded me of what my grandfather once said, the calmest water hides the deepest current. That current was moving now, slow, steady, and visible, and Sophie Ward was about to find out she wasn't swimming anymore. She was sinking. You could feel it before it even happened, the tension rolling across the lake like heat off asphalt. By the time the weekend came around, everyone knew something was brewing again. The memes hadn't cooled off, the HOA's reputation was in shambles, and Sophie Ward was desperate for one last act to salvage her crown. On Thursday night, a thick stack of glossy flyers began appearing in mailboxes all around the neighborhood. Community emergency meeting. Take back the lake. They read in bold red letters. At the bottom in smaller print, it said, hosted by the Lakeview HOA President Mrs. Sophie Ward. Now anyone with half a brain could see what it really was, a desperate PR stunt. But what made it interesting was the timing. Sophie had planned her grand town hall protest for Saturday at noon right at the marina, and since I had officially acquired the mortgage note for that very marina under my LLC Blue Cedar Holdings, her little performance would technically take place on property I controlled. And that, as my brother Tom would say, was the kind of irony you can frame. Friday morning, I stopped by his office. He leaned back in his chair, boots up on the desk, sipping coffee that smelled more like burnt ambition than caffeine. You're sure you want to let her do it? He asked. Absolutely, I said. You don't stop a show before the finale. You let the actress reach her monologue first, he grinned. You've always had a mean sense of theater. Comes with owning the stage, I said. I spent that evening quietly preparing. The deed and mortgage transfer were finalized. I had the sheriff's office verify the papers. And then for good measure, I posted an announcement on the community board, calm, polite, with just enough subtext to make people curious. Community BBQ and lake celebration. Saturday at noon. Bring food, family, and music. Free to all residents and friends. Location, the marina dock area. I didn't need to mention who owned the dock now. The timing spoke for itself. By Saturday morning, you'd have thought the 4th of July had arrived early. Families carried coolers and folding chairs. Kids ran with water guns. A local band set up under a canopy tuning guitars. The smell of grilled ribs and sweet corn wafted through the air like a peace treaty signed in smoke. Across the lake, Sophie Ward was gearing up for war. I saw her convoy, long before she reached the dock. 2 SUVs full of HOA board members, 1 car with a banner strapped to the side, "Reclaim our community waters." Behind them trailed a local news van because of course she'd called the press. She emerged in full regalia, bright pink blazer, wide hat, and the brittle smile of someone who'd already lost the argument but hadn't yet read the verdict. Citizens, she began, her voice blasting through a megaphone. For too long, our community has suffered under the reckless defiance of one man who refuses to abide by our standards of harmony. Her voice echoed across the water, drowned only by the band starting up on my side. A lively country tune kicked in, and half the crowd started clapping to the beat. Sophie's jaw tightened. "Turn off that music," she shrieked through the megaphone. Tom, standing near the grill in his sheriff's uniform, waved a rib bone in the air. "Sorry, ma'am, this is a licensed event. Public celebration. You're welcome to join." The camera crew from Channel 8 didn't know which side to film. On one end, Sophie ranted like a politician mid-breakdown. On the other, the community was laughing, dancing, eating, and enjoying freedom. Guess which side made better television? Still, Sophie pressed on. She shouted about bylaws, community standards, the sanctity of uniform waterfront aesthetics. Then she pulled out her newest prop, a printed letter with a red seal and a lawyer's signature at the bottom. "This," she said, waving it like a flag, "is an official document from our attorney confirming our jurisdiction over all adjoining shoreline property." I raised an eyebrow. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated, but the cameras were rolling. With the air of a conquering general, she handed me the paper. I read it slowly, fighting the urge to laugh. The seal was crooked, the wording was wrong, and the signature, well, it looked suspiciously like her own handwriting. I turned the letter over and showed the crowd the backside. "You might want to ask your lawyer why his letterhead says, 'Template Sample.'" The audience erupted. The laughter rippled across the dock, bouncing off the water and back again. Sophie's face drained of color. That's not relevant." "Oh, it's relevant," Tom said, stepping forward, trying hard not to grin. "Because distributing falsified legal documents is a crime." She sputtered. You're all conspiring against me." Just then, a loud clunk echoed from behind her. Her black SUV, parked half on the grass and half blocking the boat ramp, had just been hooked up to a tow truck. The same tow truck driver, Mark Hill, gave me a wink as he tightened the chain. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said cheerfully. "I'm just enforcing the new property owner's request." Sophie spun around. "What property owner?" "That'd be me," I said, holding up the deed and the mortgage paperwork in plain sight of the cameras. "Blue Cedar Holdings. That's my LLC. As of last week, the marina and its facilities, including this dock, are under my control." The crowd gasped. Then someone shouted, "He owns her stage." It spread like wildfire. Tom's laughter shook his shoulders. "Carl, you magnificent bastard," he whispered. Sophie's hands shook. "You can't do this. You can't own the marina. That's community property. Community doesn't pay the bills," I said. "You defaulted on your loan." I bought the note. Legally and cleanly. She tried to grab the papers, but Tom stepped between us. "Careful, Mrs. Ward. Touch those documents and you'll be facing another charge, tampering." The cameras zoomed in as Mark's tow truck started moving. The SUV jerked tires, squealing, the HOA banner flapping wildly like a surrender flag in reverse. The crowd roared with laughter, chanting, "Tow the Queen, tow the Queen." Sophie stumbled back, eyes wide-haired, disheveled, her megaphone slipping from her hands and rolling into the water with a splash. I leaned in just close enough for her to hear me over the noise. "You came to reclaim the lake, Sophie. Looks like the lake reclaimed you." She turned to the news camera, voice breaking. "This is a setup. I'm the victim of corruption." But the camera crew had already turned away, focusing on the celebration happening just 20 feet away, the grill smoking, the music playing, people dancing. In that moment, the community made its choice. By sundown, the HOA's credibility was gone. The news aired a segment titled, "HOA President's Protest Turns into Lakefront Festival Disaster." The reporter summarized it perfectly. While residents enjoyed a spontaneous barbecue, the HOA's attempt to enforce non-existent lake regulations ended with their president's car being towed from the very dock she claimed to control. That clip hit 1 million views by Monday morning. Sophie tried to fight back, of course. She sent out one last HOA email warning residents not to associate with lawbreakers. Nobody opened it. Some people unsubscribed from the mailing list entirely. A few replied with gifs of tow trucks. I didn't celebrate, not outwardly. That wasn't my way. I just sat on the porch that night with Tom, both of us looking out over the still water. "You know," he said, "there's something poetic about her getting towed off the same ramp she tried to take your boat from." "Poetic justice," I said softly. He took a sip of beer. "You think she's done?" I shook my head. "No. She'll find a new way to humiliate herself. Pride always reloads." He nodded toward the glowing horizon. "You ready for the next round?" I smiled, slow and certain. "Oh, I've already written the ending. She just hasn't read it yet. Because the deed was signed, the lake was mine. And the HOA, once full of bluster and bureaucracy, was now drowning in its own paperwork. The trap was set, and Sophie Ward had just stepped into it with both feet. Monday morning came with the crispness of fall creeping into the air. The lake was calm again, but the community wasn't. Everyone knew something bigger was coming. Sophie Ward had been quiet for 2 whole days, too quiet. When people like her go silent, it isn't peace, it's plotting. Sure enough, by midweek, I got a letter hand-delivered, sealed and stamped with every ounce of fake authority the HOA could muster. It read, Notice of Legal Action. The Lakeview HOA hereby files a lawsuit against Mr. Carl Sanders for unlawful possession, obstruction of community waters, and harassment of HOA officials. I chuckled. Harassment? I'd barely raised my voice. You've got to admire the imagination, I muttered, tossing it on the desk. Tom was the first to see it. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. You realize this is the legal equivalent of bringing a spoon to a gunfight, right? Oh, I realize, I said. But we'll play it their way. Let's give Sophie the grand stage she's been craving. 2 weeks later, the courthouse in town was packed to the walls. Families who'd been fined for mailbox colors were there. The retired fisherman Sophie had once cited for excessive dock noise was there. Even the local bar owner showed up wearing a shirt that read, Free the Lake. The place buzzed like a football game before kickoff. At the front of the courtroom sat Sophie Ward, polished to perfection. She wore a charcoal suit, 2 sizes too expensive, and had a stack of papers thick enough to impress someone who'd never read one. Beside her was a new lawyer, a balding man with shiny glasses and the nervous energy of someone who'd been hired on Craigslist. And when the judge entered, my grin widened. It was Judge William Whitaker, stern, silver-haired, and dignified. A man who'd spent many summers fishing off this very lake with my grandfather back when the world moved slower. I could see a flicker of recognition in his eyes when he glanced my way, though his face remained neutral. He struck the gavel once. Bang. Lakeview HOA versus Carl Sanders, he said. Let's proceed. Sophie stood with a little too much confidence. Your Honor, this man has been a persistent violator of our community's laws, undermining the authority of the HOA and causing public disorder. Her lawyer chimed in, fumbling with his notes. Yes, Your Honor, the association believes Mr. Sanders' private ownership claims are invalid and that his boat and dock encroach upon common access waters. The judge leaned back. Do you have the deeds or legal documents to prove that claim? The lawyer hesitated. Sophie jumped in. It's common knowledge, Your Honor. Everyone knows the lake has always been shared property. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. Common knowledge isn't evidence, Mrs. Ward. Please submit your documentation. They shuffled through their folders, pulling out HOA newsletters, maps drawn in crayon-like lines, and community bylaw excerpts. The judge scanned them, sighed, and looked up. I see no county seal, no registered deed, no title chain, and no surveyed coordinates. Is this all you have? The lawyer's voice cracked. Yes, Your Honor. But it's supported by the collective will of the homeowners. The law doesn't run on collective will, Whitaker interrupted calmly. It runs on legal standing. I glanced at Sophie, whose jaw had begun to twitch. Mr. Sanders, the judge said, turning to me. Do you have your evidence? I stood and nodded to Grace Holloway, my attorney. She wheeled forward a single box, labeled Sanders v. HOA, Evidence. Inside were neatly bound documents, the original deed, notarized copies, certified surveys, and title history, going back nearly a century. Grace laid them out on the table like a magician revealing the winning hand. Your Honor, she said, this is the property deed for the lake and all adjoining parcels under the Sanders family since 1932. It includes a full riparian rights description, verified by the county recorder. Here are certified plats, tax receipts, and the recently transferred marina mortgage note now legally under my client's LLC Blue Cedar Holdings. The courtroom gasped. Even the air seemed to pause. The judge flipped through the pages slowly. When he reached the page bearing my grandfather's signature, he nodded slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. This document is authentic, he said. I remember Earl Sanders. He took me fishing when I was 12. Sophie's lawyer blurted. Objection? On what grounds? The judge asked. The man blinked. Bias. The judge's tone dropped an octave. Bias is when I ignore evidence, counselor. This is called recognition. Laughter rippled through the room. Sophie's face darkened like a thunderhead. Grace continued calmly. Furthermore, Your Honor, my client has allowed open recreational use of this lake for decades without charge or restriction. He's maintained the docks, paid all taxes, and ensured safety compliance. The HOA, meanwhile, has no registered claim of ownership, only internal bylaws that extend no legal authority beyond their subdivision's recorded boundary. The judge glanced at Sophie. Do you dispute that Mrs. Ward? Her lips trembled. He forged that deed. The judge's eyebrows rose. Do you have evidence of forgery? She scrambled through her folder, pulling out a few papers, mostly photocopies of fines she'd issued over the years. These prove he's defiant. That's evidence of guilt. The courtroom erupted in laughter so loud the bailiff had to bang his baton on the floor. The judge exhaled slowly. Mrs. Ward, issuing someone a fine for mailbox color doesn't prove you own his lake. Sophie slammed her palms on the table. You're all against me. The sheriff is his brother, the Coast Guard is his friend, and you, she pointed at the bench, you're biased because you went fishing with his grandfather. The judge's voice turned cold as marble. Watch your tone, Mrs. Ward, or I'll hold you in contempt. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve. Sophie, sit down. She didn't. No, this is tyranny. The judge struck the gavel once sharp as thunder. That's enough. The evidence is clear. The lake is privately owned by Mr. Sanders and his predecessors. The HOA has overstepped its boundaries and filed a frivolous lawsuit without legal merit. He paused, letting the silence weigh heavy before continuing. This court hereby dismisses the case with prejudice. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to pay all legal fees and damages related to harassment and property interference. The crowd erupted into applause. Sophie froze mouth, open eyes blinking like a machine losing power. Her lawyer slumped in his chair, muttering something about career changes. But the judge wasn't done. He looked directly at Sophie. One more thing, Mrs. Ward. The court recognizes Mr. Sanders' right to restrict access to his property, including any HOA-affiliated activities, effective immediately. Any further attempt to assert control over this lake or its facilities will be considered trespassing. The cheers that followed shook the rafters. As I turned to leave, the judge gave me a subtle nod, the kind only old souls exchange, the kind that says, your grandfather would be proud. Sophie, meanwhile, was shouting as she was escorted out. You can't silence me. I'll appeal this. The lake belongs to the people, her lawyer whispered. Please stop talking, but she didn't hear him. Outside the courthouse, steps were crowded with neighbors cheering, clapping, and chanting my name. A reporter thrust a microphone toward me. Mr. Sanders, what are you going to do now that you've won? I smiled. Simple. I'm going to protect the lake and maybe throw a little party while I'm at it. Tom appeared beside me, adjusting his hat, grinning like a proud brother. Guess we'll need extra parking. That night, as I sat on my porch overlooking the dark, still water, I couldn't help but replay the sound of that gavel in my mind. Bang. Justice, like thunder, can clear the air better than any storm. The HOA was finished legally and financially. Their lawsuit had backfired so spectacularly that even their supporters were jumping ship. But something told me Sophie wasn't ready to sink quietly. People like her never drown fast, they flail first. And the next time she did, the whole town would be there to watch. The morning of the eviction began the way good endings should, quiet, golden, and honest. The lake lay glass smooth, the air carried a hint of dew and cedar, and sunlight spilled across the water like molten brass. I woke before dawn, poured my first cup of coffee, and stood on the porch watching mist drift over the surface. Today wasn't just a victory lap, it was the closing of a circle. By 9 o'clock, the hum of engines echoed down the road. Sheriff Tom arrived first, as always, punctual to the minute. 2 deputies followed in cruisers, lights flashing in lazy rotation, not as a warning, but a symbol that order had arrived. Behind them came a Coast Guard boat, slicing gently through the water its wake, fanning out in clean, even ripples. The community had gathered, 2 families, retirees, even the kids who'd grown up skipping stones from these very banks. Everyone wanted to witness what they'd started calling the Great HOA Exodus. Tom climbed my porch steps and handed me a clipboard. Official order, he said, signed by Judge Whitaker himself. I glanced at the heading Notice of Revocation and Removal. Below it in clear black ink were the words that made all the months of chaos worth it. The Lakeview HOA is hereby barred from all access, management, or influence over Lake Sanders and its adjoining properties. Looks like we've got ourselves a clean lake again, I said. Tom grinned. Cleaner than her reputation. We both laughed. Down by the marina, the deputies were already unloading boxes. Everything the HOA had used to decorate its little empire of control, laminated rules and fine signs, folders of citations, fake permits, even a few leftover violation stickers that Sophie had once proudly printed in bulk. They stacked them neatly on the dock like relics from a dead religion. By 10, the crowd was swelling. You could hear music starting from portable speakers, the faint scent of barbecue drifting from somewhere nearby. It wasn't an angry mob or a gloating parade, it was a gathering of relief of neighbors, reclaiming air that had been heavy for too long. And then, like clockwork, a familiar voice broke the calm. This is an illegal gathering, heads turned. Sophie Ward was back. She came storming down the path in her signature pink blazer, clutching a folder to her chest hair, wild and wind-whipped. Behind her trailed the last of her board, 4 tired faces that looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Tom muttered, "Here we go again," and descended the steps. Sophie pointed at him, voice trembling with fury. "You have no right to do this. The HOA is still active. This is community land." Tom held up the court order. "Actually, ma'am, it's not. Judge Whitaker signed this himself. Your HOA has no jurisdiction here anymore. You can't evict an association," she snapped. He raised an eyebrow. "Watch me." The crowd murmured, half laughing, half in disbelief. Sophie stepped onto the dock, ignoring the warning tape. "This is harassment. You're all conspiring against me." I walked down slowly, calm as the morning itself. "Sophie, you might want to stop shouting. People can hear you over at the diner by now." She turned on me, eyes blazing. "You think this is over, Carl? You think you've won because of one crooked judge and a piece of paper?" I held up my coffee cup. "I think I've won because I read the law. You should try it sometime." Her face flushed crimson. "I'll sue again. Be my guest," I said. "Just make sure your filing fee clears this time." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was cleansing. Even a few of her own former board members joined in. Tom stepped forward, his tone turning formal. "Mrs. Ward, by order of the court, you are hereby instructed to vacate the marina property and cease all HOA activity related to this lake. Failure to comply will result in arrest for trespassing." "You wouldn't dare," she hissed. "Ma'am," he said, "I absolutely would." For a heartbeat, I thought she might actually charge him. Her hands tightened around that folder like it was a shield. But then she saw the 2 deputies stepping closer, and the fight drained from her shoulders. Still, she wasn't done. "This is my lake," she whispered more to herself than anyone. "No," I said softly. "It never was. You just rented other people's fear and called it authority." The deputies guided her back toward the path, her voice cracking with shrill protests. "You'll regret this. Every one of you will regret this." Her words faded as she disappeared into the trees, trailed by the last remnants of her court, the once mighty HOA board reduced to silence. Tom exhaled and shook his head. "You know," he said, "I half expected her to bring a marching band." I smiled. She already had her parade. Now it's our turn. With Sophie gone, the deputies began the symbolic part of the eviction, the part everyone had come to see. They opened the boxes of confiscated HOA material and began stacking the signs in a tall, careful pile at the edge of the dock. There were dozens: "No swimming without approval," "Violation unauthorized color scheme," "HOA property, members only." Tom gave a nod, and 2 men from the Coast Guard stepped forward carrying metal pails of lake water. Together they poured the water over the stack. The ink ran like melted mascara, dripping down into the boards until the words dissolved into nothing but black streaks. The crowd erupted into cheers. A little girl perched on her father's shoulders started chanting, "Freedom Lake, Freedom Lake." Within seconds, 100 voices joined in. Someone struck up a fiddle tune, others clapped along, and for the first time in years, the sound around the dock wasn't rules or fines, it was laughter. As I stood there watching a man in a blazer approach, tall, serious, holding a folder, I recognized him instantly, one of the regional investors who had tried months earlier to buy out the HOA's shared water rights. He looked nervous now. "Mr. Sanders," he said cautiously, "I believe we should talk. I had a pending agreement with the HOA to acquire partial control of." I stopped him with a raised hand. "You mean the water rights they never owned?" He blinked. "Well, yes, technically, I interrupted. "You were about to buy air, and even that air is covered by a clause in my grandfather's deed, right of first refusal. You can't buy 1 drop of this lake without offering it to me first. And I already refused." He swallowed hard. "So the deal is dead," I said. "Just like their jurisdiction." He nodded slowly. "Understood." And walked away, briefcase swinging like a white flag. By noon, the formalities were over. The deputies packed up, the Coast Guard saluted, and the sheriff's cruiser lights flicked off. Tom lingered a moment longer, scanning the smiling faces. "You know," he said, "I've been in law enforcement 30 years. Never seen a crowd cheer for paperwork before." "Guess they've seen enough bad ones," I said. He grinned. "You staying for the party tonight? Wouldn't miss it." That night, the lake was alive again. Strings of lights glowed between trees. Music echoed across the water, soft and steady. Boats circled lazily under the moon, their reflections shimmering like moving stars. Kids chased fireflies while grown-ups swapped stories of HOA horror and sweet revenge. Jim from the yellow ranch house raised a beer toward me. "Carl, you did it, man." I shook my head. "No, we did it. I just read the fine print." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Later, when the music quieted and the laughter softened into the low murmur of satisfied souls, I found myself alone on the dock. The pile of ruined HOA signs was gone, replaced by a lantern glowing on the railing. The water below was still reflecting every star in the sky. Tom joined me silent for a moment before speaking. "You think she'll ever come back?" I smiled faintly. "If she does, she'll find out the hard way this lake doesn't forget." He chuckled. "Neither do you." "Guess I learned from the best," I said, glancing at the framed photo of our grandfather I'd brought down for the occasion. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of singing from across the water. People were still celebrating. The lake shimmered as if smiling back at them. Peace, real peace. Doesn't shout, it hums, it breathes, it lasts. I took one last sip of cold coffee and whispered into the night. "For you, Grandpa, the lake's free again." And with that, the wind stirred the water, scattering the last reflections like a curtain closing on a long, absurd, beautiful play that had finally reached its final bow. The following morning, the lake slept late. After weeks, months of chaos, it was finally silent again, a kind of silence that carried gratitude instead of tension. The water was smooth, broken only by the slow drift of a lone kayak. The smell of wood smoke still lingered from the night before, when laughter had spilled over the docks and fireworks had mirrored themselves in the rippling waves. I sat on the same porch I'd watched Sophie storm down so many times before. But today, the only footsteps I heard were ducks waddling across the grass. The HOA signs were gone, every one of them. In their place, kids had planted little flags made of cardboard, each painted with messy letters that read things like "Freedom Lake No More Fines" and "We Love Carl's Dock." I had to admit I liked their sense of humor. My phone buzzed. It was Tom. "Morning, Judge Sanders," he said, laughing through the line. "Don't start," I replied. "I'm retired from battles. Only fishing now." "Well, you might need a bigger net," he said. "The county just called. They want to rename the lake officially. Lake Sanders on the record this time." I blinked. "You're kidding." "Nope. They said it's what the people are calling it anyway, so they might as well make it legal." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My grandfather would have grinned so wide his pipe would have fallen out of his mouth. "That old man would have loved this," I said quietly. "Yeah," Tom said. "Guess you finally finished what he started." When I hung up, I stood and walked down toward the water, the wooden boards of the dock creaking underfoot. The morning sun hit the surface, and for a second the lake looked like liquid gold. I could see my reflection, older, sure, but steadier than I'd ever been. There were no more HOA guards patrolling, no one shouting about violations or community standards. Just families coming to fish again, the smell of pancakes from the cabin down the road, and the sound of a dog barking somewhere in the trees. Peace had weight to it. You could feel it on your shoulders after carrying conflict for so long. Later that afternoon, a few neighbors stopped by. Jim brought a cooler full of iced tea. Linda carried her guitar. Even Nancy, the woman Sophie, once fined for improperly festive lawn ornaments, showed up with a basket of cookies. We sat in lawn chairs near the water and watched as kids skipped stones across the lake. Every splash felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence we'd all been waiting to finish. "You know," Jim said, "I don't think any of us realized how much fear we'd gotten used to. Every week, another letter, another fee, another violation. We just paid it and went on. It's like we were living with a headache so long we forgot what quiet felt like." Linda strummed a few lazy chords. "Yeah, and Sophie made us believe she was doing us a favor." Nancy nodded. "She made me cry once over a wreath, for heaven's sake. Said it was non-compliant with seasonal uniformity." We all laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from healing, not mockery. I leaned back, feeling the wood warm beneath the sun. "Funny thing about control," I said. "It only works if people forget they can say no." They nodded, quiet for a moment, the lake murmuring beneath the breeze. Then Linda said softly, "You could have kicked us off too, Carl. You owned this lake the whole time, but you didn't. You let everyone keep using it." I smiled. "That's because it was never about owning it. It's about protecting it. My grandfather used to say, you can't own something you love, you just take care of it so it can outlive you." Tom joined us later, still in uniform, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one and sat on the railing beside the dock. So he said, "What happens next? You gonna open the lake officially, make it a community spot again?" "Already did," I said, pointing to the new wooden sign I'd hammered in that morning. It read, "Lake Sanders welcome neighbors. Respect the water. Respect each other. No HOA, no nonsense." Tom grinned. "Straightforward. You should run for office." I laughed. "No thanks. I've seen what happens when people get too fond of clipboards." He chuckled and took a long sip. "You know, I got a call from the state office this morning. Sophie tried to file an appeal." I raised an eyebrow. "Of course she did. Judge Whitaker already denied it," Tom said. "Apparently her evidence included memes she printed from Facebook." That made me laugh so hard, I nearly spilled my coffee. Guess she's still fighting ghosts. Yep, he said, smirking, and losing to them too. The sun dipped lower, turning everything honey-colored. Boats drifted by slowly, kids waving as they passed. The lake was alive again, not ruled, not regulated, just living the way nature intended. As the evening settled, a small group gathered again on the dock as they had the night before. Music played softly. Someone lit lanterns and set them afloat, each one drifting farther out into the reflection of the stars. Linda began singing a slow, gentle tune that carried across the water. No microphones, no announcements, just her voice, mixing with the crickets and the soft lapping of waves. Tom leaned toward me. You realize you're a local legend now, right? The man who evicted the HOA. They're already telling your story at the diner. I groaned. I didn't do it for fame, Tom. I know, he said, grinning, but admitted it's one hell of a story. I looked out at the lanterns gliding across the water, their reflections trembling like a heartbeat. Yeah, I said softly. It is. After a while, the laughter quieted. People started heading home, leaving behind only the glow of the last few lanterns and the echo of music on the wind. I stayed until the final light flickered out, then walked back up to the cabin. On my desk sat the old deed, still framed behind glass. Next to it, a photo of Grandpa Earl standing knee-deep in the water holding a fishing rod and that familiar half-smiling squint. I touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "We kept it safe, old man." The floorboards creaked softly as I sat down and began to write the story, not the one the reporters wanted, not the viral clips or the courtroom headlines, but the truth. A story about how a lake isn't just water, it's memory. How laws mean nothing without integrity. How power without respect becomes noise, and noise always fades. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked out the window. The moonlight shimmered on the lake, silver and still. Somewhere out there, Sophie Ward was probably drafting another complaint, another email, another illusion of control. But the lake didn't care. It belonged to no one, and somehow that made it everyone's again. That was the real victory. Not the fines overturned, not the lawsuit dismissed, not even the eviction itself. The victory was seeing a community remember how to live without fear. I took a long breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and said it out loud to the empty room, to the stars beyond the window. Freedom isn't about owning the water, it's about keeping it clear. And I swear somewhere deep beneath the lake's calm surface, it felt like the water answered back. Sometimes the loudest people in the room mistake noise for power. But true strength is quiet, it's in patience, in persistence, and in the courage to stand your ground without shouting. This story isn't just about an HOA or a lake. It's about boundaries, knowing where yours begin and where someone else's ends. It's about defending what's right, not with anger, but with proof and peace. So, if you've ever faced your own Sophie Ward, someone who pushes too far, someone who mistakes authority for ownership, remember this: the truth doesn't need to yell. It just needs to stand firm and wait for the tide to turn. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a Karen or an HOA nightmare in your own neighborhood? Share your story in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this journey, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next HOA showdown. Because out here on HOA Stories, we don't just tell revenge tales, we remind people that peace, when earned, is the sweetest victory of all.